In those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations at the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. Behold, I am coming soon, and my reward is with me. Every eye will see me, to repay each one according to their deeds, the kingdom of God. The sky turned a deep blue, but it was not the blue known to men. It was a blue that shone as if the entire firmament were filled with an indescribable light, a light that came from no star and no sun. That light came from one being alone, Christ. In his second coming he appeared in all his splendor, surrounded by angels who radiated a blinding light. And as this was happening, the living were seized by an irresistible force. No one remained where they were. It was as if every soul was being drawn by a call that could not be denied. Everyone was being taken to the same place, to the same moment, to the same encounter, before the throne. Silence once again took over everything, but now it was different. This was not just reverence, it was expectation. Every person knew, even without saying it, that this was the most important moment of their existence. Then, the voice was heard, not like an ordinary voice, but like something that pierced the very core of every being. It was a voice that did not merely speak, it revealed. Every thought, every intention, every choice made throughout life seemed to rise to the surface before that presence. There were no more secrets. What had been hidden in the deepest places of the human heart was now exposed with absolute clarity. The angels began to move, with precision, in perfect order, as if following an eternal command that had never failed. They moved through the crowd, and then they began to call names, one by one, without error, without hesitation, without forgetting. Each name carried a story, each call carried an entire lifetime, and when a name was spoken the person could not resist. Their feet moved, even if fear tried to stop them. Their body stepped forward, even if their mind wanted to flee. It was as if the truth itself was pulling each one toward it. A man, upon hearing his name, felt his strength leave him. His knees hit the ground before he even realized it. His eyes filled with terror, not because of what was around him, but because of what he knew would be brought to light. His life began to be revealed, not in words, but as if every moment were being relived before everyone. Forgotten decisions, careless words, hidden actions, everything was there, clear, undeniable. He tried to speak, tried to justify himself, tried to find some way to explain what he was seeing, but there was no room for arguments. Deep within himself he knew the truth could not be changed. Around him, others began to feel the same weight. Some wept silently, others stood frozen, unable to react. But there were also those who, even in that moment, kept their eyes fixed on the throne with something different. Hope. Not because their lives had been perfect, but because at some point they'd held on to mercy. And then something began to happen. At first almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore as the moment passed, a separation began to form. There were no physical barriers, no visible commands. But everyone knew. On the right were those surrounded by a gentle light, not their own, but reflecting something greater. On the left were those enveloped in a dense, heavy shadow, as if carrying the weight of everything they had rejected. It was not appearance, it was essence. The inner reality of each person was now visible, and there was no changing it, no pretending, no turning back. The judgment had begun, and in that moment, a single question echoed silently in the heart of all humanity. Is there still hope, or has the destiny already been decided? And it was exactly at that moment that something unexpected began to happen. And it was exactly at that moment that something unexpected began to happen. Among those on the left, surrounded by the shadow of their own choices, a movement drew attention. It was not a loud sound or a grand gesture, but something simple, almost imperceptible, yet enough to break the weight of that moment. A young man stepped forward. His face did not carry the same hardness seen in many around him. There was fear, yes, but also something different, something that could not be ignored. His eyes were lowered, not out of shame before others, but because he recognized the truth within himself. When his name was called, he did not resist. He walked slowly toward the throne. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if he carried not only his body, but the weight of his entire life. And when he stood before that presence, he did not try to justify himself. He did not try to defend himself. He did not try to hide anything. He simply spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but in that absolute silence, everyone could hear it. Lord, is there still forgiveness for me? The question cut through the crowd like an invisible blade. Some lifted their eyes, others remained still. But no one was indifferent, because deep down that question was not his alone, it belonged to everyone. For a brief moment time seemed to stand still. The young man remained on his knees, unable to lift his face. His heart pounded, not with expectation, but with surrender. He knew who he had been. He knew the choices he had made, the paths he had taken, the times he had ignored what was right. But he also knew that at some point he had repented, and that repentance was now all he had. Then Christ stood up. The movement was simple, but enough for all creation to respond. The light around him intensified, not as a blinding glare, but as something that revealed even more deeply. His eyes turned to the young man, and in that gaze there was not only justice, there was knowledge, there was truth, there was compassion. Christ saw beyond actions. He saw the heart. He saw the moment when that young man had been broken inside, when no one else was watching. He saw the repentance that had not been shown to the world, but had been sincere before God. And then he spoke. Your repentance has been heard. There were no shouts, there was no applause. But in that instant something changed. A light began to surround the young man, gentle yet powerful. It did not come from him, but it transformed him. As if everything that held him back was being removed layer by layer. He fell completely to the ground, not in despair, but in gratitude. And around him, the angels began to move. This time, not with the solemnity of judgment, but with a joy that seemed to echo throughout that place. The young man was led, not to the left but to the right, among the righteous. A murmur spread through the crowd, not of confusion, but of impact, because in that moment something had been revealed clearly and unmistakably. God's justice was not blind, but it was not cold, it was perfect, and along with it came mercy. But not everyone reacted the same way. On the left, some hardened their hearts even more. Their faces showed indignation, as if they could not accept what they had witnessed. Others, however, began to tremble even more, because they realized something. If that young man had been heard, then truth was still being considered, and that meant every heart was being evaluated, not only by visible actions, but by the deepest intention. And then the names continued to be called, one after another, without interruption, without delay. Each person stepped forward, each life was exposed, Each story was revealed with absolute clarity. Some tried to argue, others remained silent. But the outcome did not come from words, it came from truth. On the right, the number of the righteous grew, men and women who, in life, had lived by faith, even in the midst of failure. People who had fallen but got back up, who had made mistakes but repented, who were not perfect but sought God with sincerity. They were surrounded by a light that was not theirs, but now defined them. On the left, the number of those who'd rejected also grew, not only out of ignorance but by choice. Those who hardened their hearts, who preferred their own ways, who lived as if there were no consequences. Now they stood before the consequence, and there was no escape. The contrast became more and more evident. Light and shadow, hope and despair, life and separation. And then, in the midst of that scene, a certainty began to form in every heart. That moment was not just about judgment, it was about eternal destiny. Christ remained standing before the throne, observing every soul, every reaction, every truth being revealed. His presence did not lessen the weight of the moment, but it also did not remove the possibility of redemption for those who truly surrendered. The judgment continued, and the further it advanced, the more impossible it became to ignore what was coming, because soon the final sentence would be declared. And when that moment came, there was no haste, there was no anxiety. Everything happened with absolute precision, as if every moment had already been determined from the beginning. Christ remained standing before the throne, and his presence filled that entire vastness. His eyes moved across the crowd, not in a distant way, but deeply personal, as if every soul were seen individually, completely, known in full. Then the voice of God was heard again. This time not like a thunder that shook everything, but like a declaration that sealed. The righteous will inherit eternal life. The words were not shouted, but they echoed with an authority that could not be questioned. They were not only heard, they were understood. And immediately something changed. Those on the right began to be surrounded by an even more intense light. It was not just an outward glow, but a transformation that seemed to reach the deepest parts of their being. Every burden, every guilt, every pain that still remained was completely removed. It was as if for the first time they were completely free. Some fell to their knees, not in fear, but in gratitude. Others lifted their eyes, now without tears of anguish, only with a peace that could not be explained in human words. Around them the angels drew near, no longer as messengers of judgment, but as servants of a fulfilled promise. Their faces reflected joy, and their movements carried a lightness that contrasted with the weight that had once dominated that place. But on the left, the silence was different. There were no cries, there was no rebellion, there was awareness. Each one knew that that moment was final, and the wicked, eternal separation. The declaration was clear, simple, irrevocable, and with it, reality was established. The shadow surrounding those on the left grew denser, not as a punishment imposed, but as the consequence of what they had chosen to carry throughout their lives. It was not merely a separation from a place, it was separation from the presence of God, and that in itself was enough. Some tried to look at the throne one last time, others closed their eyes, but none of them could deny the truth. Meanwhile, on the right, something began to happen. The righteous began to be led, not in haste but with purpose. The angels guided them, and every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something their hearts had always longed for, even without fully understanding it. The environment began to change. That vast arena of judgment, which once seemed endless, began to dissolve like mist carried away by the wind. What had once been the setting of judgment now gave way to something completely different, something new, something restored. The old earth was no longer there. Everything that had once been known, cities, seas, mountains, disappeared as if it had never existed. There was no chaotic destruction, no ruin, but a perfect transition, as if a new reality were being revealed. And then it appeared, the new earth. Not as a simple continuation of what existed before, but as a completely restored creation. Everything was alive. Everything was pure. Everything seemed to carry a beauty that no human mind had ever been able to imagine. The righteous stood in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because there were no words enough. The air was different, light, pure, without weight, without pain, without any trace of what had once brought suffering. And as they moved forward, a city began to appear before them, descending, not built by human hands, but prepared, the New Jerusalem. It did not impose itself merely by its grandeur, but by its perfection. Every detail reflected absolute harmony, as if everything there had been made not only with power, but with intention. A light emanated from the city, but it came from no visible source. It was the very presence of God. The righteous began to approach, and with every step something within them was restored even more deeply. Memories of pain no longer hurt. Scars no longer weighed them down. The past no longer had any hold. It was as if all of it had not been erased, but transformed. And then a gentle yet authoritative voice was heard. "Welcome home." The words were not just an invitation. They were the fulfillment of a promise. Some began to weep, but not as before. These were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fullness, of finally arriving, of finally belonging. Meanwhile, the gates of the city stood open. There were no guards blocking the entrance. There were no barriers, only access. The righteous began to enter, and as they crossed that threshold, they realized something they had never experienced before. There was no more fear, no more doubt, no more separation. There, God was present. And this time, forever. But even in that moment of absolute peace, something else was yet to be revealed, something no one expected. But that would completely change how they understood everything they had lived through. But even in that moment of absolute peace, something was still about to be revealed, something no one expected, and something that would completely change how they understood everything they had lived through. The righteous moved forward through the city, still in awe of everything around them, when they realized they were being led to a specific place. It was not a forced call nor a direct command, but a gentle pull, as if their own hearts knew where they needed to go. A large area opened before them. It was a wide space, surrounded by a deep tranquility, where the light seemed even softer, more welcoming. There were no imposing structures, no elements that stood out through grandeur, yet there was something different, something that touched the soul directly. And then they all began to gather, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. A silence filled that place, not an empty silence, but one full of expectation. Something important was about to happen. Christ appeared among them, not distant, not elevated on a throne, but close, walking. His steps were light, but his presence was impossible to ignore. As he passed each person, His gaze lingered for a moment, as if he recognized not only who they were, but everything they had lived through. And in that gaze there was something many had not yet fully experienced: complete understanding. "I know every tear you have shed." His voice was gentle, yet it reached everyone at once. There was no echo, no repetition. Yet each word felt as though it was spoken directly to every heart, every pain, every loss, every silent moment when you thought you were alone. I was there. The words did not bring sadness, but remembrance, and for a moment the righteous felt again what they had lived through on the old earth. The losses, the injustices, the difficult nights, the prayers that seemed unanswered, the goodbyes, the pain no one saw. And then, tears began to appear, not as suffering, but as something that still needed to be touched. Christ approached the first person, a man who, in life, had carried deep pain he never shared with anyone. He tried to remain strong, but he could not. His eyes filled, and before any word was spoken, Christ reached out his hand. With a simple gesture, he touched his face, and in that instant, everything changed. It was not just comfort, it was restoration. The pain did not simply disappear, it was transformed, as if every difficult moment had been completely redefined, revealing something that could not be seen before. The man fell to his knees, not out of weakness, but relief. And then Christ continued, step by step, person by person. Each touch carried something unique. Each encounter was personal. Some had been persecuted, others had lost everything, some had lived in silence, others in constant struggle. But all had one thing in common: they had suffered, and now they were being restored. The tears that once represented pain began to turn into something different: gratitude, understanding, peace. It was as if, for the first time, they understood that nothing had been in vain, that every moment they had lived, even the hardest ones, was part of something greater. Now, there will be no more pain. Christ's voice echoed again, but now not as a future promise, as a present reality. It is finished. And in that moment, something invisible yet deeply real was broken forever. The weight of the past ceased to exist. Not as forgetfulness, but as transformation. The righteous began to look at one another, and they noticed something new. There were no more barriers, no comparison, no envy, pride, or any trace of the old nature. Only unity, only peace. A young man who had lost his family on the old earth slowly approached. His eyes still carried the memory of what he had lived through, but there was no more pain. "Lord, I lost everything." His voice was not sorrowful but sincere. Christ looked at him with tenderness. "And now, you have found everything." The answer was not long, but it was enough. The young man smiled, for the first time, completely. Around them the atmosphere changed even more. What had once been peace was now fullness. Sounds began to emerge, not noise, but harmony, as if all creation was responding to that moment. The trees, the wind, the very ground seemed to vibrate in perfect unity. The angels began to sing, but not as a performance. It was an expression, a natural response to what was happening, and the righteous, without realizing it, began to join that sound. Not because anyone asked them to, but because they felt it. There was no obligation. Everything was natural. Everything was real. Christ then stopped at the center of that place and looked at everyone. His face expressed not only joy, but satisfaction, like someone seeing a completed work. You were not only saved, you were restored. and those words carried a deeper meaning than any of them could fully grasp in that moment, because it was not just about being in that place, but about finally becoming who they were always created to be. And in that instant, everyone understood something that once seemed distant. Eternity was not just living forever, it was living whole, without pain, without lack, without separation. But even with all of that revealed, there was still more, something even deeper, something that would not only restore what had been lost, but reveal the true purpose of everything. But even in the midst of that fullness, something was still beginning to be revealed, not as a sudden new event, but as an understanding that gradually formed within each person. The righteous began to realize that this place was not merely a final destination, it was a beginning. The city was not static, it was alive. Every detail, every path, every element seemed to carry movement, purpose, intention. Nothing was there by chance, and at the same time, nothing felt forced. It was natural. It was perfect. Some began to walk beyond the central streets, guided not by instructions but by an inner understanding, as if they knew exactly where to go, even though they had never been there before. The city opened in different directions. Gardens stretched out in harmony, rivers flowed with a lightness unlike anything from the former earth, and in the distance, vast fields revealed a creation that knew no decay and no limits. A man stopped before a tree. Its branches moved gently, not only because of the wind, but as if they responded to the life around them. Its fruit was not merely food, but carried something deeper, something that nourished not just the body, but the very essence. He reached out his hand and touched one of the fruits, and as he did, he felt something different. It was not hunger being satisfied, it was life being expanded. Around him, others experienced the same. Everything there did not merely exist, it served, but not in the sense of necessity, in the sense of purpose. The righteous began to understand that they were not there just to observe. They were there to live, and to live in that place meant to participate. A group approached a region where the river flowed more strongly. Its waters were clear, but not only transparent, they were alive. When they touched the water, there was not just freshness, there was renewal, but not like before, when something needed to be healed. It was continuous strengthening, as if every experience there expanded even more what was already perfect, and then something became clear. Each person began to discover something unique, not imposed, not assigned, but revealed, a purpose. Some were drawn to care for the creation around them, not as work, but as expression. Others were led to explore, to learn, to go deeper into everything that was being revealed. Some gathered together, sharing, creating, developing, not out of necessity, but out of joy. Nothing was repetitive, nothing was empty, everything had meaning. And the more they lived, the more they understood. Purpose was not something external, it was part of who they were. A man walked through the fields, observing the harmony of creation, when he realized something he had never experienced before. There was no conflict within him, no doubt, no struggle. What once required decision was now natural. He did not need to choose to do good, he simply was. And this did not come from effort, it came from alignment. Then Christ appeared among them again, not as someone distant, but present, walking with them, participating. His eyes observed everything with attention, not as one who supervises, but as one who rejoices in seeing what he had always planned now being lived in its perfect form. It was like this from the beginning. His voice spread, reaching everyone. And it will be like this forever. The righteous began to understand. The former earth had not been merely a passing place. It had been a process, a path that, even marked by failure, led to this moment. Now everything was restored, but not only restored, elevated. Their relationship with one another had no barriers. There was no comparison, competition, or need for recognition. Each saw the other with clarity, with joy, with unity. And this was not something they had to maintain, it simply existed. A group gathered near the river, not to rest, but to share what they were discovering. Their words were not empty or repetitive. Every conversation revealed something new, something deeper, as if eternity itself were unfolding before them. And then they realized something even greater. This would never end. Not because time would repeat itself, but because there would always be more. More to know, more to live, more to experience. Eternity was not static, it was expansive, and this did not create anxiety, it created joy. Christ looked at them all once more, and in his gaze there was something clear: satisfaction, not only for what had been done, but for what was now being lived. You are now living in the purpose for which you were created. And those words did not bring weight, they brought freedom. Because for the first time, there was no difference between existing and fulfilling purpose. It was the same thing, and in that moment they all understood. They were not just in the right place, they were who they were meant to be, and that changed everything. But even with that understanding, something still needed to be revealed. Something that did not concern only what they were now living, but why all of it had been necessary from the very beginning. But even with that understanding, something still needed to be revealed. It was not about what they were living, it was about why all of it had been necessary from the beginning. The righteous continued walking through the new creation, living in that reality which no longer carried pain, doubt, or any fragment of what had once been imperfect. Even so, a perception began to arise among them, not as unrest, but as a silent calling to understand something greater. Then Christ led them, not with direct words, nor with commands, but with his very presence. As they moved forward, they arrived at a place unlike any other. There was not the same vastness of the fields, nor the flow of the rivers, nor the structure of the city. It was a place of revelation, a region where everything seemed deeper, more intense, as if it was not only about living, but about understanding. And then, before them, something began to happen. It was not a distant vision. It was as if history itself was being opened before their eyes. They began to see, not with natural eyes, but with understanding. They saw the beginning, creation being formed, not as something simple, but as a perfect expression of God's will. They saw the original harmony, the clear purpose, the complete communion between the Creator and what had been created. But then they saw the rupture, the moment when disobedience entered, not as a small mistake, but as a choice that changed everything. The entrance of sin was not just an act, in alignment, a separation that brought consequences spreading throughout all creation. The righteous watched in silence, now, without pain, but with understanding. They saw how the world was affected. They saw the suffering that followed, the injustices, the wars, the losses. Everything that once seemed like chaos now began to make sense within a greater context. And then something even deeper was revealed. They saw Christ, but not as they were seeing him now. They saw his coming to earth. They saw his life among men. They saw his rejection, his pain, his sacrifice. Every moment was revealed with absolute clarity, not to cause sorrow, but to show the price that was paid. And in that instant, everyone understood something they had once only believed. Redemption was not simple, it was costly, it was intentional, it was complete. The silence remained, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence of understanding. Then Christ spoke. Everything that was allowed had a purpose. His voice did not carry complex explanations, but it brought clarity enough to reach every heart. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was in vain. The righteous began to realize what once seemed unjust now revealed justice. What seemed meaningless now showed direction. What seemed like pain without purpose was now seen as part of a greater plan, not because suffering was desired, but because even in the face of it, God never lost control. Every detail, every moment, every human choice had been seen. And still, God had guided everything to that point, to complete restoration. A man looked around, absorbing everything that was being revealed, and realized something he had never understood on the former earth. God had never been distant. Not in the hardest moments, not in the silent moments, not in the deepest pain. He had always been present, but now, this was no longer faith, it was certainty. And then, something shifted even further. The righteous began to see their own lives, but not as isolated memories, as part of something greater. Moments that seemed small had impact. Decisions that seemed insignificant carried weight. Actions done in silence had value, and all of it was connected. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had been ignored. Faithfulness, even in the smallest things, had been seen, and now it was understood. Christ walked among them once more. His gaze did not carry only approval, it carried revelation. You did not live only to arrive here. The words echoed with depth. You were part of what was being built. And in that moment, everyone understood. The life they had lived was not just a phase, it was participation, it was involvement, it was contribution within an eternal plan, and that gave meaning to everything. Even to what seemed small, even to what seemed forgotten. Eternity was no longer just a place of rest, it was a place of complete understanding, without doubts, without unanswered questions, without any mystery left unrevealed. But even with all of this, something still remained. Something not tied to the past, but to what would continue forever. But even with everything revealed, something still remained. It was not doubt, it was not lack, it was continuity. The righteous remained in that place of revelation for a time that could not be measured, absorbing everything they had seen, understanding what on the former earth they had never been able to fully comprehend. There were no more questions, no more inner conflicts, only clarity. And then, little by little, that vision began to close, not abruptly but gently, like a book being closed after it's been fully understood. The creation around them once again became the center of their attention. The new earth, the city, life. But now, everything was different, because they were not just living in that place, they understood it. Every detail carried meaning, every element revealed intention, and above all, every existence there reflected a perfect relationship with God. Christ remained among them, and his presence was no longer only revered, it was lived. There was no distance, no separation, no need for intermediaries. It was direct communion, constant, living. The righteous began to walk again, not as before, discovering the place, but now participating in it with full awareness. Every step was light, every action was natural, every choice flowed effortlessly, because there was no longer any division between will and obedience. Everything was aligned. In the distance, groups formed, not out of necessity but out of connection. They shared experiences, explored together, developed what had been entrusted to them. Eternity was not static, and this became more evident with each moment. It was expanding, and the more it expanded, the more it revealed. A man walked near the river of life, watching its continuous flow, when he realized something he had never felt before. There was no expectation, because there was no lack. There was no fear of the future, because everything was already secure. And yet, there was excitement, not from uncertain unknowns, but from the certainty that there would always be more to live, more to know, more to experience within the presence of God. And that did not create anxiety, it created joy. Then Christ turned to them once more. His eyes moved across creation, but also across each of them, and then he spoke. "Now you see." The sentence was simple, but it carried everything. Before you believed, now you know. And in that instant they all understood. The faith they had lived on the former earth had become complete sight. What once required trust was now reality. What once seemed distant was now permanent. And that did not diminish the journey they had lived. It gave it value, because it was through that journey that they arrived there. Christ continued, "You were faithful in time. Now you live in eternity." The words were not just a statement, they were a conclusion. The process was complete. The journey had been fulfilled, and now, true life was beginning. But then, something shifted, not in eternity, but in perception. It was as if, for a moment, the narrative they were living began to open beyond themselves, as if what they were experiencing was not only for them, but also for those who had not yet arrived. And in that moment, understanding expanded once again. The story was not only about the final destination, it was about the path, about time, about decision. And in a silent yet deeply clear way, something began to form, a connection, between that moment and all those who were still living on the former earth, as if eternity were looking back, as if that scene were not just a distant future, but a present call. And then, for the first time since everything began, the question was no longer only within the story. It reached the one who observes. Because the reality of that place was not just a promise, it was a destination, and the only thing separating someone from it was not time, it was decision. And in that moment, silence returned, but not as before, now, filled with meaning, as if something were about to be said, something that would not change eternity, but could change those who have not yet reached it. And in that moment, silence returned, but not as before. Now it carried a different weight. It was not the silence of judgment, nor the silence of revelation. It was the silence of decision. Everything that had been seen, everything that had been lived, everything that had been revealed, now pointed to something beyond that eternal scene. The reality of the new earth remained perfect. The presence of God remained full. Eternity continued, alive, expanding, complete. But at the same time, it was as if that reality was being presented, not only as a destination, but as an invitation. Christ remained silent for a moment. His eyes were no longer only upon the righteous. It was as if they reached through time, as if they extended beyond that place, beyond that scene, beyond that already established eternity. And then he spoke. He who has ears, let him hear. The words were simple, but they carried an authority that could not be ignored. It was not a statement for those who were already there. It was a call to those who are still walking, to those who are still living, to those who still have time. The image of the new earth remained before them, the peace, the fullness, the absence of pain, the constant presence of God. All of that was not only the end of a journey, it was the fulfillment of a promise, but it was also an answer to a question that everyone at some point has asked: where is all of this going? And now the answer was clear, not as theory, not as religion, but as reality. Eternity was not a distant idea, it was a real destination, and everything that had been shown was not just to impress, it was to awaken, because while that reality was already final for some, for others, it was still being decided. Life on the former earth continues, days passing, choices being made, paths being followed, and often, without realizing it, eternal destiny being shaped in silence. Then Christ took one more step forward. His presence remained firm, unshakable, full of authority, but also filled with something that had never ceased to exist: love. I am coming soon. The declaration was not a threat, it was a certainty. And my reward is with me, to give to each one according to their deeds. Justice remained, but mercy was still available. And that was the most important part, because it meant there was still time to reflect, time to change, time to turn back, time to decide. Eternity does not begin only after death. It begins in the choices made now, in the paths chosen, in what is valued, in how one lives when no one is watching. The world continues, the distractions continue, the voices continue, but in the midst of all that, the truth also continues, quiet, constant, calling, and in the end, everything comes down to one single question. Not what you heard, not what you know, but what you did with it. The new earth is not just a prepared place, it is a promised place. But a promise is not an imposition. It is a response, and each person responds with their own life. Silence returned one last time, but now it were not empty, it was space. Space for decision, space for reflection, space for truth. Because one day the heavens will open again, and on that day there will be no more time. But today there still is, and that changes everything. If you made it this far, it was not by accident. There is something within you that wanted to hear this until the end, and maybe this is the moment, not of emotion, but of decision, because in the end, it will not be about how much you heard, it will be about how much you lived, and the question remains, not distant, not theoretical, but direct. When that day comes, which side will you be on? If this message spoke to you, follow the channel, but not just to watch, to keep walking. Because this story is not